After being crushed in local elections last month, Spain's socialist prime minister called a snap general election for July 23rd. It was a risky political move for Pedro Sanchez, and polls suggest that right-wing parties are gaining popularity, including the radical right. Was it a gamble too far, then, for Sanchez? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. Pedro Sanchez's decision to face down his detractors is the biggest political risk of his life. And if it doesn't pay off, which is very likely, it could open the door for the hard-right Vox party to enter the corridors of power as part of a coalition government.
It was a disastrous showing in regional elections that made the left-wing Sanchez call a national vote months before he needed to. He was behind in the polls at the time, but this was seen as an attempt to scare the electorate into thinking the alternative was the far right. But the polls have barely changed since he called the election, and they suggest a right-wing majority under the People's Party leader is the most likely outcome. Spain's economy is growing faster than most of its EU partners, so why is the current Prime Minister in danger of being booted out? What's driving the political mood in Spain?
So let's meet today's panel. Joining us from Madrid, we have Andrés Santana, who's an associate professor at the Autonomous University of Madrid. Meanwhile, in Norwich, here in the United Kingdom, we have Marian Arribas-Tome. She's a lecturer at the University of East Anglia School of Politics, Language and Communication Studies. And joining us from Barcelona, we have journalist Blake Evans-Pritchard, who specialises in Spanish politics. Andrés, I'm going to start off with you if I can. Are you expecting a close result? Because we're nearly up to the wire here in this election. And what happens if Vox does well?
I don't expect Vox to do especially well in comparison to the last elections, but I expect that Vox will be more relevant than it has been so far, at least in national elections, because in the previous elections, Vox did not have the chance to be a key player because anyway right-wing parties did not have enough seats to be able to create a government. In these elections, what we expect, or at least what I do expect, is that right-wing parties, mainly the People's Party, which is the traditional Spanish conservative party, and Vox will together get enough seats to form a government, but probably the PP will not have enough seats to conform a government on its own. So the PP will depend on the support from Vox to be in government, either the external support from Vox or Vox in a coalition. And in this sense, even if it fares somewhat worse in terms of seats, in terms of vote share also, it will be able to have much more power than up to now.
Andrés, let me come in here because we have some polling data from the sort of Spanish polls over the course of the last year or so. If we bring those up on the screen now, these polling results show that the opposition People's Party is roughly on about 35% at the moment. Socialist Workers' Party is currently on 28%. Hard-right Vox Party should come in, if everybody votes the way they say they're going to vote in one of these things, on around 13%, which is roughly the same as the far-left Sumar Party, comparably speaking. So what makes you think that Vox is going to underperform?
I don't know which survey are you considering. It depends. The precise result depends on one survey or another one. But most surveys tend to forecast that Vox will get about 10 seats less, or at least 5 or 6 seats less than it was getting in the previous elections. Nobody is forecasting 52 seats for Vox any longer.
Marian, are you on the same page with that?
Well, yes, I think as Andrés is saying, Vox is going to be more relevant in terms of forming coalition, potentially with the People's Party. And in that way, of course, there are a few waves being created, as we saw in the debate yesterday night, live debate between the two main players, where this idea of coalitions came up. And of course, all the coalitions that these two players can make are controversial. And that brings us into an interesting topic. There's not a perfect coalition partner, I think, for any of these two leaders of the People's Party and the Socialist Party. And yeah, depends on the polls you're looking at. You will see that some will say that some seats will be granted when Vox does fairly okay, and could be adding to the seats that the People's Party can get in the election, therefore maybe making this a functional government, but of course a problematic one as well.
Blake, what do you think is going to happen in this upcoming election?
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with the other panelists. I think that Vox is definitely a force that's now going to have a lasting impact on Spanish politics and the direction that things are moving in. Certainly more so than it did, a few years ago when it really started galvanizing support. It definitely looks as though it's a party that's here to stay. But what I would say is that Sanchez has been very smart in calling an early election in the way that he did after the regional elections. When he did poorly, he took the decision to immediately call an early election for a couple of reasons: to stop the PP controlling the narrative, but also to really sort of push forwards to really sort of galvanize the anti-far right vote. And if you listen to a lot of his speeches, he's really sort of playing to that fear that there could be anti-right sentiment, far-right support in the next election. So people need to sort of rally behind the left. And that seems to, if you look at the polls, that seems to have had some success in that Sanchez has been gaining ground since he took that decision to call that early snap election.
Blake, a couple of things to break out of that, but I suppose the first one is, you think that it was quite a smart move by the Prime Minister to bring in this early election. A lot of other people have said that it was a great, great risk, especially calling it in the month of July, because nobody knows who's going to be away on holiday, who's going to be present for the election. So what do you make of the risk? You think it was a clever gamble?
I think this speaks volumes to the kind of person that Sanchez is. He is a risk taker, a very shrewd risk taker, likes to take these kind of calculated, risky moves. And I think it is playing out well so far. And also, when you look at some of it is very interesting to call it in the middle of the summer, when a lot of people will be away. And the question is whether more PP supporters and Vox supporters, because one of the interesting things about Vox is it takes a lot of its support from the middle class, some of the sort of wealthier citizens of Spain, the kind of people that are going to go on foreign holidays. So potentially they could be out of the country when this election takes place. It is a risky gamble, but I think that's who Pedro Sanchez is.
Andres, do you think this is a risky gamble? Do you think it was a good choice?
I concur with Blake that it was a risky but a correct gamble in the sense that it is more likely that the kind of sociological background of the voters of the right are more likely to be away on holidays. Still, I think that Sanchez is gonna lose the elections. I think there was also another gamble there, given that just after the regional and local elections we had on May the 28th, the parties to the left of the PSOE had not yet prepared their platform. So the early elections have probably helped Sanchez to be able to be in a good position to take some of the votes of those parties. So although the vote of the left is not likely to be enough for left parties to govern, the relative share of the PSOE will not be so harmed.
Marian, what are the issues that are driving this election forward? What do you, given that it's been called as a snap election, what is it that everyone's focusing on here?
Well, depends on who you speak to. Of course, the socialist supporters will speak of an improvement in the economy, somehow having seen Sanchez be successful in faring to some extent with a number of crises and bringing inflation to a level that is more or less acceptable given the context in which we all are. That would be definitely a topic that they will sort of brandish as a positive one. There's some concerns about what happens when the right-wing governments take over, because we have seen already indicators that the topics concerning the environment are difficult ones, and we need as many players united. And from the point of view of the European Union, a good consensus to take action and to take critical action at a point when we need that sort of thing. So a shifting government will be a problem, and this is a topic, I think, to some extent also playing a part. Minorities and rights for the minorities, including women, have been also put on the table as at risk if the People's Party takes his share of movement. And therefore, this is also a kind of element that has to be considered. Of course, I think Pedro Sanchez plays a little bit with the vote of fear. We have seen the regional elections, how the People's Party have already created coalitions and have already talked to Vox, and it is real, therefore. And Pedro can point at this as a reality that it has a real threat to it. And I think that will speak to some voters to some extent.
Okay,
So,
you've mentioned their fear and threat, those two words together in the same sort of couple of sentences. So let me bring this back very slightly, because similar things were played out for the elections prior to them occurring in Italy. Everyone's like, oh no, Giorgia Meloni, when she comes to power, she'll be a fascist. The moment she came to power, tack, much more, I wouldn't quite say centrist, that's not quite fair, but certainly a tack towards the centre. Justice and Law has been a party in power in Poland. Plenty of people upset about how that party's been in office, but it has certainly not been quite so right-wing as had previously been feared elsewhere. Is there not a concern here, Marian, that they drum up, you're going to end up in a boy who cried wolf situation if you end up with a right-wing party and they don't do badly?
Of course, I mean, it is difficult to see how these things play out in ahead of the game. But we have seen already a controversial topic being put on the table. Recently, we were discussing the Doñana National Park in southern Spain and all this problem with irrigation, the use of water, and how the use of water was being politicized somehow, being used as a topic that was creating some division. Those who were supporting caution and a completely different approach to the way water is used in the region, mostly left-wing sort of positions were, in front of the right-wing elements, which were trying to use water a bit in the way Vox would use that topic to the benefit. So we have seen how the People's Party can use environmental issues for political reasons. And we don't know whether this is just a temporary strategy, and it could well be, just to gain some support, or it could be a long-term or middle-term sort of position. So it is a reality, that there's a space for seeing both, maybe retracting and changing, positions, or going ahead with certain promises that have been already made. It's difficult to assert, either way at the moment.
Blake, I'm going to bring this across to you and put it a little bit differently if I can. When we're looking at these right-wing parties and people are concerned about where they've come from, let me quote the philosopher Bill Clinton for you. It's the economy, stupid. If we look at the rise of the AfD in Germany, it's mostly happening in East Germany. In East Germany, the economy's been a little bit more depressed. It went through deindustrialization. A lot of these issues are rising up in those areas. If we look at places where the far right rises, it's generally an economic issue. There is no economic issue in Spain compared to the rest of Europe, where people are experiencing 12, 15, 20% inflation. What is going on?
You don't have that huge kind of economic problems to kind of rally around. I feel that one of the reasons that the far right or the extreme right has been able to gain support, and certainly this was very true kind of like sort of 4-5 years ago, when everyone was talking about the possibility that Catalonia, where I live, would break away in a bid for independence, was this whole thing of Vox to kind of make Spain great again was their slogan, to actually kind of like centralize control and say we're one country and we can't separate certain regions, or we can't give too much autonomy to certain regions. And that's exactly what, again, with his risk-taking mentality, that's exactly what Sanchez was doing when he relied on support from Catalonia and from the Basque region, which didn't sit well with a lot of Spaniards who don't believe that any thought of great autonomy to these regions should be entertained. So I think that's really sort of helped the far right gain support.
Andres, what do you think it's down to? Why is Rajoy so unpopular, given that relative to other European leaders, he doesn't seem to be doing that bad a job? It's certainly not like the United Kingdom, where we've been through 4 prime ministers in a relatively short space of time.
Well, let me first say something about fear, because I have been listening to previous opinions, and I would say that fear of a coalition government of the People's Party and Vox is no longer an argument. It cannot give too many votes. All the people who voted for the People's Party in the regional and local elections, they knew that in most of the places, the only way the People's Party could get power was with the head of Vox. So let me say that first. Then, answering your question, well, Sanchez's economic record is not very good. I mean, the economic growth now is high, but in comparison to other countries, but only because we have been in a much worse situation in the previous years. If you see the accumulated economic growth during Sanchez governments, it's been almost stagnated. It got back to 2019 level. I think it was the previous month. In all the other countries, it was in Europe, it was before. So that's not a good record. Obviously, if you have gone much slower before, if you speed up a little bit in percentage terms, it seems you are growing faster. Yeah, but that's only because you did worse. And it's not only the economic policies of Sanchez that are harming him. The very policies that should help him, like women-related policies, they have been very problematic because they have meant that many offenders, like rapists and all that, have seen their sentences reduced, and more than 100 have been able to go out of prison because of the policies enacted by Sanchez's government. So it's obviously not a good record, the one he has.
Blake, I've got a quote here, this from the founder of Vox, Santiago Abascal. This is what he has to say about immigration.
When I talk about immigration, despite the disgusting manipulation of many media outlets, we distinguish clearly between legal and orderly migration according to the needs of the national economy and the migrants' capacity to adapt. And on the other hand, there is illegal mass migration, People condemned to risk their lives because of human trafficking by mafias and NGOs, and who are also condemned to have no future, to crime, and at the same time condemn our people and the most degraded and poor neighbourhoods to insecurity.
Blake, up until now, immigration hasn't been quite so much of an issue in Spanish politics as it has been elsewhere across Europe. I guess that's because of the free flow and exchange between Latin American countries and Spain as they go back and forth. Now it seems to be rising up as more of an issue. What are you putting that down to?
I mean, that's an interesting one. It's still, to my mind, a little bit questionable as to how many votes there is to be gained in talking too much about immigration. I mean, I think in certain areas...
It's not the hot button issue. It's not the hot button issue it would be in, say, the UK or Greece, is it?
No, exactly. So it's still not kind of, when you look at the sort of rhetoric in the UK and the fact that there's a very clear mileage to be gained by, talking about, the problems that are afflicting the country being blamed on the migrant. That's I feel in the UK that's very cut and dry. It's less so in Spain for a variety of reasons. But I think one of it being kind of like Latin America relationships. The other being that there's no real sense of Euroscepticism in Spain, and that's partly historical, I think, because after the end of the Franco regime, the last dictatorship in Western Europe, there was a sense that European institutions and embracing the European community kind of helped pull Spain out of that dark period. So there has not been that historical immigration issue. But at the same time, I'm feeling like listening to Abascal and others on the sort of far right. They are now talking about immigration. If you read their manifesto, they've got some clear deport illegal immigrants, take a sort of hard line on kind of fundamentalist mosques that are very similar to the rhetoric being espoused in places like the UK. But whether that's going to translate into greater support, I'm not so greater share of the votes, I'm not so sure.
Marian, what do you make of the immigration issue, Spain and Vox?
Yes, I think there's an ideological position on the part of Vox, which has played into some form of polarization on this topic in Spain. I think it's part of this idea of fear-mongering that some smaller parties like Vox can benefit from at times. And of course, it has some form of grain of truth in the sense that, yes, waves of immigration keep happening. And as we know, across not only for Spain, but across the Mediterranean area and the Canary Islands as well, of course. So there's some form of basking on this reality, but the way you can frame this issue can change completely the way you perceive it. Of course, Vox does it in a way that can be, threatening, can make people feel unsafe. But that doesn't have to be the case. And I think in the context of the European Union, we have very strong sort of policies, ideas about how to deal with immigration. Of course, there's not a complete consensus, and it's a question that's still for debate and dialogue, but not something that we can simply, let's say, reduce to the frame that Vox would like to impose on the debates.
Okay.
I would argue.
Okay, Marian, I've got to put this to you. If we were talking about France, or we were talking about Germany, or we were talking about Sweden, we were talking about the rise of the hard right, or the radical right, or the far right in those countries, bandied about by left-wing journalists would be words like fascist and fascism. Now, obviously, in Spain, that has a very different context because within living memory, there has been a fascist in power. All right, it may be a distance back, but it's still within living memory for some people. And I note that with Vox, people are very, very hard to talk about hard right or radical right, and yet still the term far right and fascist keeps getting thrown at them. Is that fair? Is that reasonable? How does that play out in the Spanish context?
It is, of course, igniting a lot of heated debates, and it really makes or takes away the rationality that you could actually expect to have in this type of dialogue. So it doesn't help, because it really has these connotations and very strong emotional connections in people's minds, and it in a way distorts the value of the debate. That could be a very good thing to discuss, and it is discussed in other sort of places in Europe, in other countries, but depending on the history, of course, this and the way you describe and the words you use, you can see it may have very different outcomes. I think we have to be reminded occasionally that Spain is also a country of immigration. We have been, and we have still immigration. People from Spain go to other places to look for jobs, and they did indeed a lot of that in the 60s and 70s as well. So I think you could frame the debate in very different terms, and people would perhaps get more understanding. But this is missed sometimes in these heated debates that are, as I said before, sort of based on very polarized views and ideological views.
Andres?
So we have to take care of the language.
Andres, Marian, Blake, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. However, if you wish to see more discussion and debate, just head on over to our YouTube channel and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and the entire team, thank you for watching and goodbye.